Hi everybody, I'm Stefan for Tuts, and in today's tutorial we are going to take a look at a very interesting plugin for Cinema 4D called Greebler. So let's get started by creating a new cube object, and let's go to Plugins, Greebler, and drop down the Greebler. And in order to make it work, we need to take the cube object and make it a child of the Greebler. And as you can see, we have some change here, some geometry generated. And basically what the Greebler plugin does is generates some random geometry and creates a very simple shapes look very complex. So let's get started. Let's select the Greebler plugin and make some room here, and we are going to start with the first tab, which is the object tab. The basic and the coordinates tabs are standard, so let's get started with the object tab. We have only a few properties here. The first is the random seed, which basically controls the distribution of the random shapes and the extrusion here, the basis for the shapes on our object. So if you don't like the current random seed, you can change it and change the positioning of the shapes. Currently the shape looks pretty simple, and in order to make it more detailed, you can increase the subdivisions here. But be careful, because if you increase it way too much, your computer may freeze. Basically what this does is subdivides the polygons, and you can do it another way. If you set this to 0, you can go to the cube options, and if you increase the segments to 5, you can see that this also increases the detail here. But I prefer to keep it at 0 and control everything from the Greebler plugin. So for this example, let's increase the subdivisions to 3, which gives us a fair amount of detail. And the next thing you can do is to greeble back of the polygons. So if you click this checkbox, you can see that all of the greebles disappeared, and if we zoom in and go inside the cube object, you can see that we generated all the greebles inside of our object. So it might be helpful to generate greebles on the inside part of an object. So let's hit H on the keyboard to zoom out and go to our perspective view here, and let's turn off the generate back of the polygons. And we have retain input objects, which I'm going to explain a little bit later what it does. And we have exclude all area polygons and exclude thin polygons. And what this does is, if we increase the number here quite a lot, you can see that we exclude the entire cube and we don't have any greebles on this part. So for this example, let me set this to 1, and let's turn off the Greebler for now, and let's increase the segments of our cube. And if we make it editable and go to polygon mode and select this polygon here, for example, and extrude it by hitting MT on the keyboard, we are going to extrude this one like so. And for example, we can extrude inwards or outwards this one, and let's see, select this one on the top and extrude it inwards, and basically create some random extrusions here. Select this one, extrude it a bit more, and basically we are going to create some complex looking shape by simply extruding a few of the sides of the cube, and I think this is enough. And let's enable the Greebler, and you can see how this one looks so far. So now if we go and exclude all area polygons and increase it, you can see that it removes the greebles from the wall area polygons here. Let's set this to 1, and we can see that we have greebles on this side here and here. And if we set this to 100, you have only on the high areas of polygons greebles. So this is pretty helpful. And if we turn off this one and increase the exclude thin polygons to 500, for example, this removes some of the greebles here, as you can see. And if we click the retain input objects, you can see that this affects our input object. So for example, if we set this to 0, we have the greebles, and if we increase this, let me reduce the subdivisions because the project is way too heavy now, and if we increase this number, it starts to exclude polygons. And if we crank it up, you can see the effect. It removes parts of the shape. Let's reset this one, and let's remove the cube from the Greebler for now and turn it off, and let's create a sphere object. Let's increase the radius a bit and change the type of the sphere, and let's drop it under the Greebler, and let's set this to 1. And now if we increase the exclude low area polygons enough, you can see what happens, and basically you can create some pretty interesting results. You can see something like a star shape here, and you can remove the greebles and have only the star shape cut here. And if we set this to 1 and increase the exclude thin polygons, basically it creates the same result in a bit different way. So that's it. It's pretty helpful, and you can create some very interesting effect using these properties here. At the moment I'm going to set this to 0 as well, and for the demonstration I'm going to use the sphere object. So the retain input object is important in some cases, and you can turn it off to achieve this type of results. And let's go to the base tab, and we have a generate base, and if we click this checkbox, we basically don't generate any base for the greebles anymore. And if we go to our object tab and click on the retain input objects, you can see we retain and keep our input object, which is the sphere. And let's go to the base. If we click generate base, basically what this does is extrudes the polygons in a random way that we can control from these properties here to create a more complex looking shape. So if you want only the greebles, you can go to object and turn off the retain input objects, go to the base and turn off generate base, and that way you keep only the greebles, and you can create a copy of the Greebler inside. For example, let's just Control C and Control V this one. Let's create a copy, and let's take the sphere and make it 80 centimeters in radius, and let's go to the Greebler and generate base, and you can create some pretty interesting shapes. It's like a super high-tech planet or something like that. So this is going to be pretty helpful if you try to create something like that. And let's delete the inside for now, and let's enable the generate base in the retain input objects for now. And here we have some properties. First of all, the sparsity, which if we increase, basically it controls the randomness of the extrusion of the base. So 100% sparsity, we don't have any extrusion and any bases basically. And if we set this to 0, everything is extruded, and there is a randomness because some of the polygons are extruded more and some of the polygons are a bit less extruded. So we can control that from here. We have a height and minimum and maximum value for the height, and for example we can set the minimum value to 20 and the maximum to 100, and this creates this type of effect. And the same thing for the bevel, we have the minimum value of 5, let's make this one 25, and the maximum, let's set it to 200. And as you can see how this affects the shape, and basically 100% is the maximum, and there is not much of a difference, but you can control it. If you don't like to have bevel, you can remove it completely. And let's make this one 15. And basically, if you want to create much more a random pattern here, you can set the sparsity to 50%, and as you can see, this creates a pretty interesting result. It's much more complex looking right now. And if you want, you can add a funk tag to this, and you can control the funk angle depending of your needs. I prefer to keep it turned off for now, for the sake of the tutorial. And let's move on to the next step, which is the stock greebles. And here we have basically 3 sub-tabs, and the first one is the shapes. We have the generate greebles checkbox that if we turn off, we remove all of the greebles, and we can use the Greebler plugin for just randomizing the base shape. But if you want some greebles on top of it, you can turn this on and have the greebles. And let's open the settings, and basically we have a lot of settings here. The most important ones are, for example, let me increase the surface offset, and basically this offsets the greebles from the surface. And we have a minimum and a maximum value for the surface offset, and if we set the surface offset to 50 for the minimum and to 150 for the maximum, basically it randomly distributes this and distributes the greebles between 50 and 150 centimeters from the main object. So this is very interesting result here. And the same for the height of the greebles. We can set this to like 10 and 50, and it's going to generate some shorter greebles like this one here, and some longer between the 10 and the 50 range. And basically it's the same for the bevel and the length and the width of the greebles. So that's pretty straightforward once you understand the logic of the plugin, how it works. And let's set this one to 15 and this to 5. And you can add a funk tag here as well if you wish. Let's set the surface offset to 0 right now. And basically let's increase the offset and rotate to see the greebles here. And you can see that we don't have any caps on the back side of the greebles. And if you wish to have caps, you can click the add bottom caps checkbox here, and we have the back caps enabled right now. Let's set the surface offset to 0 because this option is clear now. And the next thing we are going to do is to click the relax positioning, which basically creates a different pattern of positioning for the greebles. If we zoom in, you can see the difference. And the next option here is form to polygon shape, and basically it can create some pretty strange results here. Depending of your base shape, the result will be different. So let's turn off this one, and if we increase the sparsity, it controls the amount of greebles we have. If we set the sparsity to 100%, we don't have any greebles. If we set it to 0, we have the full amount of greebles, and if we set it to 50%, basically we have only 50% of the greebles. So let's set this one to 0. And the next option is max greebles per polygon, which basically if we increase it, it's pretty straightforward. We have the max greebles per polygon is 5 right now, and if we increase this, we are going to increase the density of the greebles. and create much more complex looking shape. And let's say this one to 3, just so the project runs much faster. And we have the align globally checkbox here. If we click this one, you can see that all the greebles can be aligned globally. So for example, we can move them and rotate them as needed, and that might be helpful in some cases. In this case, I prefer to turn it off. Close the settings tab for now, and we have the next tab, which is grouping. We have bars, and here let's find an example for the bars. So you can take a shape, and for the bar shape we can control the frequency of this shape. If we set this to 0, we are not going to have any bars right now, and if we set this to 50%, we are going to have the bars. So let's set this to 100%. We can enable random surface rotations, and if we enable it, you can see a bars here, and basically this creates a random rotation. And we have the surface rotation as well by pushing this slider here, and we can control the number of the bars. The minimum is 2 and the maximum is 5. For example, we can set this to 4 and the max to like 10, and this increases the bars. We can change the shape of the bars. We can set it to box, for example, or diamond, or you can use a letter, for example the T letter or the H, and let's set this one to 2 and this to 3 to see it better. You have a full control over the different shapes. You can preserve the aspect. For example, you can set this to 10 and play with the settings to create a different look, and change the shapes to some different shapes as well. You can see how this one looks. If you don't like the bars, you can change it to cube, for example. And let's go to the array, which is basically the same thing. We have the bars, the array, and the circular array. We can control the frequency, how often this shape is generated on the geometry here. For example, if we set this to 0, you can see that we removed some of the greebles. We have the random surface rotation. Here is an example of the array. We have the surface rotation, again the minimum rows and columns here, and the maximum, so you can create some pretty dense shapes here. The preserve aspect, and again the shape can be a different shape. The same thing for the circular array. And let's go to the shapes, and this is the interesting part. We have all the shapes used for the greebles, and let's make some room here. Basically, if you don't like a shape, you can turn it off. You just need to click on the shape and it becomes a gray, and this shape is no longer used when generating the greebles. So for example, you don't like this shape and this one and these two shapes, maybe leave this enabled, and you can control the frequency of each shape. So for example, you want this shape to exist, but you want to reduce the frequency to 20%. So basically we have only 20% of these greebles generated here, and that's pretty straightforward for all the shapes. We have random surface rotations. You can enable this for this particular shape, or you can rotate it manually here, and this works for all the rest of the shapes. So that's clear now. Let's go to the box, and as you can see, we can't modify anything because the box is disabled. So let's enable the box, and right now we can modify let's enable all of the shapes, and right now we can modify the box. So let's find an example for the box, maybe here. Let's select the greeble, and right here we have a box, and we can control the inner width of the box as you wish, and we can decide where to be the hole of the box in the middle. We can move it to the side, and the same thing for the cylinder and the rings. We can increase or decrease the rotation segments. For example, I see a cylinder and a ring object here. We can play with the rotation segments. If our scene is pretty heavy, we can decrease the segments to 5 to get a different look, as you can see, or 6, depending of the look you're going for. We can set the size minimum and the size maximum, for example 50 and 100%, and let's set this to 100 for now. And we have inner ring size, which we can increase or decrease, and again control where the hole of the ring is going to be. Let's reset it to 0. And for the regular polygons here, the same thing. We can play with the sides and stuff like that. Basically the same as the cylinder and the ring, so I'm not going to explain it anymore. And basically that covers most important settings you need to know to start working with Greebler. And here we can use some custom greebles. You can load them from a library, and you can create a preset, for example, and save it and load it later on for a different project, for example. And let's create a cool looking interesting scene right now. So let's turn off retain input objects, and maybe we can play with the exclude low area polygons, and that works on the base polygons. So if we turn this off, we have only the greebles, and if we enable it and go to the object and play with exclude thin polygons and low area polygons, this is going to impact the look we are going for. So let's select the sphere, and if we increase the radius, it's good that it affects the radius of what we have here right now. So let's set this one to 250, and I think this is good enough. So let's delete the cube and let's create a copy, and let's select the sphere and set it to 150%. Go to the Greebler settings for this and disable these options, and basically we want to set the sparsity to 0, and maybe randomize a bit more the inside part here. And let's create another copy, and let's see, select the Greebler, and let's go to object and make sure that the retain input objects is turned off, and let's go to the stock greebles and go to the settings and play with the surface offset. So let's create a surface offset between 150 and 300, and let's play with the height, set this to 10 and this to 20, and randomize the shapes a bit. And basically it creates some sort of a very high-tech random planet look. Maybe we need to decrease the surface offset to 100 and maybe 200 because it's way spread out, way too much. And let's create another copy and let's disable the generate greebles for this copy. Let's turn off the rest of the copies and play with the base. So let's enable the exclude all area polygons and thin polygons, and let's play with the sparsity as well. And let's generate the greebles for now and set them to 0 just to have some details. And what we need to do is to increase the radius of our sphere, and let's enable the rest of the objects and play with the radius. So maybe around here, and let's go to the Greebler and let's see, we want only a few parts here, and let's create a very simple white texture for this one, and let's drag and drop it on all of the objects. For example, for the inside you can create another material, and let's turn on the transparency and apply a Fresnel shader here and just invert it, and let's disable the color and enable the luminance, and maybe create a bit of a blue color. And if we drop this to the middle here and do a quick render, you can see the effect. Maybe we need to go to the render settings and you can enable the cell renderer, and let's enable color edges and set the edge color to white and the background color to black. And if we do a render now, you can see how it looks like. And I'm going to remove this material for now and set this one, and go to the render settings again, remove the cell renderer and apply ambient occlusion and global illumination. And let's create a white for our scene. Let's create a very simple white, maybe here, and let's set the color of the white to warm, and let's create another white up here, and let's increase the intensity a bit and set the color to cool color, like bluish, and set the shadow to area, and let's zoom in a bit, and let's go to the render settings, and for the global illumination for the secondary method I'm going to use a white mapping, and let's increase the samples to high. And now let's do a render. Here is the render, and as you can see the result looks pretty interesting. You can create much more detailed and complex looking shapes, and if you texture it and put more time into texturing and whitening the object, you can create some pretty amazing results. So that's it. Hope you liked the tutorial and find it useful. Once again, I'm Stefan for Tuts Plus, and we'll see you next time.